Hello, everyone, and welcome back to PSF 401 Political Behavior. This week, we'll be looking at primary elections. I hope you had a restful and productive spring break. On that note, I should have your midterms graded by tomorrow, so be sure to check on Canvas and find your grades there. As I said, this week we are looking at primary elections. The first thing to note here is that political parties in the United States are not monoliths. Political parties are not made up of homogenous voters that all have the same preferences and will all vote the same way. Political parties in the United States are better characterized as what we call big tent parties, or otherwise many perspectives underneath the same partisan label. This is largely due to the two-party system that we have as a result of plurality voting. Other countries, Argentina, the United Kingdom, India, have multiple different parties with a tighter focus, allowing for a greater coherence of messaging and expectations of unity within that party. Because we only have two parties here in the United States, they operate to capture a much broader section of the public and a lot of different views within them. As a result, these parties have many different factions and sub-factions within that single party label. And this big tent style of modern parties can allow for a better use of resources and prevent unnecessary conflict, but internal discipline within them is relatively low. You can't force, or the parties can't force a legislator to vote one way or another. And factions within these parties are largely free to contest or contend with one another for control of the party, if we want to put it that way. The faction within that party is usually, though in control, is usually the one with the greatest number of elected representatives or elected politicians more broadly. They are seen to control the party. They tend to control where resources are going to be allocated, set guidelines for messaging, set policy or other legislative priorities, and so on. Now, primary elections themselves are the candidate selection process. Elections, caucuses, and alternative systems like the top four open primary systems that we have here in Alaska. These are largely democratically controlled, or to put it another way, this is a way through which the public can decide their candidates in a given election. Now, this is not an unbiased game in any way, shape, or form. Party elites, donors, and other forces can put their thumbs on the scale in a number of really significant ways. Also, many state party organizations exert control onto who can actually run in a party's primary, be that those who have been registered with the party for a certain period of time, whether it be residency restrictions or others. State parties often served as a filtering mechanism for who actually gets onto that primary ballot. Now, one of your required readings this week, Kmark, describes how primaries can influence the direction or the focus of a party. Fundamentally, incumbents themselves are unlikely to dramatically change their positioning, their messaging, once they are in office. Incumbents are generally risk averse, as most other people are, and they're going to stay with the strategy that got them there. Barring very exceptional circumstances, let's say, incumbents are not going to dramatically shift from one election to the next. They're going to try and remain consistent with some degree of flexibility within there. Challengers, or those who are not current representatives or otherwise politicians, they are often representatives, knowing or otherwise, of factions within that party. If a particular incumbent is governing in a way that is not desirable or not acceptable to one of those other factions within the party, they may support a primary challenger to be a representative of that factions. And as a result, primaries are one way to identify factions within a party. More primary challenges means a growing strength of that faction, or changing opinions within that party, or even an influx of new members into that party. Primary elections, therefore, are a really good way of looking at the internal composition of parties, where there is strength, where there is change. Now, for many incumbents, being primaried is a much more significant threat than actually losing a general election. Many districts, many states are either solidly blue or solidly red. A Republican, for example, is not going to win in New York's 8th or ninth district. A Democrat is not going to win the gubernatorial election in a state like Mississippi, for example. Thus, in these states, in these districts, the real election is the primary, not necessarily the general election. Now, Kmark uses the examples of the Tea Party, MAGA, and Bernie Sanders' progressive wing as examples of factions within the parties themselves. A useful comparison point could be the Occupy Wall Street movement that emerged and kind of was active in the early 2010s. These movements, the Tea Party, MAGA, and Bernie Sanders movements, kind of progressive wing of the Democratic Party in the modern era, they have put significant amounts of time, resources, and effort into fielding strong primary challengers and have seen electoral success as a result. Going through these in order, the Tea Party, the kind of fiscal conservatism of that era, challenged the Bush era neoconservatism, the kind of traditional view of what the Republican Party was at that time. A few years later, the kind of MAGA populism that we're seeing now challenged the more traditional conservatism of the Republican Party. Looking at the Democratic Party, the kind of Bernie Sanders wing of progressivism or democratic socialism, depending on what kind of label you want to put on there, has challenged the traditional liberalism within the Democratic Party. Occupy Wall Street, on the other hand, didn't really put the same degree of effort and resources into playing the political game, as it were, and was much more of a grassroots political movement, a demonstration movement to signal dissatisfaction with some trends in American politics. Now, you could argue that this was the beginning of the Bernie Sanders swing in the Democratic Party, but it really took some time to affect Democratic messaging and Democratic policy priorities there. This was perhaps a signal within the Democratic Party that allowed for the progressive movement to take a much more active role in coming years, but this was kind of the early or nascent shift in the kind of internal factional struggle within the Democratic Party here. Fundamentally, we can't really look at third parties at the national level, look at their electoral success and say, okay, this third party is doing better, therefore the American public is more supportive of their messaging because of the big tent style two-party system that we have. Instead, we need to look at primary elections, at primary results, to get something of an indication of where the ground is shifting within the parties themselves. Because much of the change, much of the demands of the American public is funneled through this primary process. So we need to really look at how primary elections themselves are contested. Kmark does a really good job looking at the change in messaging, the change in, to some degree, strategies during these primary elections, both at the congressional and the presidential levels, to kind of look at how that process evolves. So I'll leave you to that in order to read that to get a better picture of that.
So let's look at how primary elections themselves are contested. Brady, Hunt, and Pope examine the strategies of congressional elections, or put it more accurately, the candidates within congressional elections. And the question is where the candidates themselves should be positioned, or should position themselves, or to quote the authors, should they align themselves with their general or primary election constituencies. Primary voters are distinct and have distinct preferences compared to general election voters. For one, depending on the primary rules, they're partisan, so their preferences are already skewed to one side. But think about the kind of person who will vote in a primary election. Most people don't even know when primaries are, much less consider who is running or incur the cost to actually go vote in that primary. As a result, we usually see around 20% turnout rates in primaries as compared to around 50 to 65% in midterm and general elections, respectively. Primary voters themselves tend to be the most politically engaged, and as a result of that, or perhaps because of that, they have the strongest and often most extreme preferences if we are conceptualizing ideology as a single-dimensional scale. They are also older, they are more affluent, they tend to be better educated, and overall have more of a stake within politics. So returning to the candidate strategies here, this is a two-stage game. Candidates first need to take a visible position at stage one, or the primary stage, in order to maximize their chances of winning that primary. But then at stage two, the general election, they can't be so out of step with the general electors, or the general election voters, that they are guaranteed to lose. Moreover, candidates are not free to completely modify their positioning from stage one to stage two. They usually will try to moderate from the primary to the general election, but they can't simply move to the center. They have made promises to those primary voters, those 10 or 20%, and they need to rely on those voters come election day. Also, if they moved too far, those voters will feel betrayed. They will feel as though those campaign promises are insincere and can't be counted on, and therefore that will artificially decrease turnout. Also, their opponent can point at the campaign statements they made previously during the primary stage and point at those and say, look how extreme this person is. The candidate can't then turn around and say, that was 2 months ago. I'm a completely different person now. I have a completely different political outlook. It doesn't wash. And so therefore, they need to adopt a slightly more extreme position in the primary stage that can be slightly adjusted for the election. As a result, making clear policy promises at the primary stage usually isn't a great decision, unless those are going to be the cornerstone of the campaign itself. Think back to our discussions on ideology, and specifically the reading by Conover and Feldman. Effective candidates will signal their ideological position at the primary stage, generally without making definitive statements that their general election opponent can use against them. They'll use those signaling mechanisms rather than set forth a key policy priority at that stage. Now, the other side of this strategic game relies on the strength of their primary opponent. If they are facing a well-funded, strong candidate from a different faction within that party, they will likely be forced into taking a clearer, more extreme position than they would otherwise. If they take a safe, relatively moderate position, they are more likely to attract strong primary challengers over time. If they are being centrist, one or more of the factions within their party is very likely to throw their support behind a primary challenger. And the voters will very likely support that challenger as the needs and demands of the primary voters are unmet over multiple election cycles. Now, when we consider this alongside the modern trend of polarization, primary voters themselves are becoming more extreme. As a result, candidates need to appeal to these voters in order to not be primaried. Candidates also cannot swing back directly to the center in time for election day. And as a result of this, those Congress members who are elected are becoming more and more extreme over time. Moreover, those elected are less representative of the demands of the median voter, increasing dissatisfaction with governance and potentially reducing the likelihood of voting, all else equal, thus reinforcing this cycle over time. Where we get more and more extreme candidates, they are less representative of the general public come election day. To kind of bring this full circle, there may be a bit of a silver lining here. If we see candidates that over time become more and more extreme, become less and less aligned with the general public's desires, there may be a, shall we call it, space for third-party, independent, or nonpartisan candidates to be elected by serving the needs and demands of the general public. Alternatively, and what we've seen here in Alaska are changes to primary systems themselves. Something like our top 4 open primary can be put into place in order to give those in the center of the ideological distribution a voice. Conversely, it may be, it could be helpful, but on the other hand, it may provide an even greater voice to that 20% of the electorate that actually votes in the primary. Remains to be seen under which circumstances and under which systems those actually operate. So that's all I kind of have for today. Keep in mind that your next reading analysis is due this Sunday by midnight. Keep in mind that I will have the midterm exams posted on Canvas tomorrow. And as always, feel free to contact me with any concerns or questions that you have. Enjoy the rest of your week, and I will see you back here next Monday.